Well, what a soggy mess Christmas was this year, at least for where I am, which was in the east of Australia. Now, given this is generally barbecue country, barbecue season, no doubt this put a damper on much of the usual vibrant festivities around Christmas. This to me feels quite fitting, not just because I'm just a massive Grinch, but it just perfectly sums up the year for me. Hopes getting dashed, things not quite living up to the hype. It has been a year of letdowns. Now, obviously, there are things that would have bucked this trend, and I'm sure there are many people out there who have had amazing things happen to them. But broadly, I think this theme is what best applies as a summary for the year. So, let's engage in a bit of confirmation bias and look at how anti-hype these last 12 months have been. This was the year that E3, the big yearly hype machine for video games, was announced to be cancelled, and then right at the end, finally announced to be officially dead. And much of the gaming stuff this year followed suit. Much of what was super hyped up, Diablo 4, Starfield, did not live up to expectations. I think the game with the largest hype to fail ratio though was Redfall. This was a game that had a lot going for it, a well-known studio, making a game with a lot of character, and a cool premise backed by not only Bethesda, but now by Microsoft. Even my friendship group, who basically just play Fortnite every day, tried this on release day. Such was its publicity, and yeah, it was absolutely terrible. It was kind of playable, but it was just so clear how lacking it was in every department. In fact, I think this year, such as it is, I was so much more aware of the bad games that came out than the good ones. And even when we did get a genuinely good game, the discourse was like, I think this game is too good, actually. Please make sure you don't apply this standard to other people and other games, please. And I'm just like, what is happening? Why do we have to destroy something that's just genuinely good, created by hardworking, talented people? We can't just celebrate the fact that we have something good that does a good thing? So anyway, that's how video games were this year. Tears of the Kingdom was good though. In other entertainment stuff, it would seem that the hype around superhero movies has finally died off, with basically all of them failing, except for two. And before we move on to the next section, you might be thinking, hey, what about Barbenheimer? That was super hype, it was organic, and it lived up to expectations. Well, I mean, sure, if you like big, high-budget marketing ad in the form of a movie, and then going to see the next movie where you basically just take a nap and then wake up when the new kids, then yeah, I would say that's hype living up to expectations. I actually kind of like both those movies. This gets to something interesting to me though, because I think Barbenheimer wouldn't be as big a deal in our minds as it is now if it weren't for another major event that happened, which was the Hollywood strike, which ended up taking a massive chunk out of the Hollywood hype machine and allowed Barbenheimer to be basically uncontested. And the things we have to thank for that strike are the streaming services and AI, which nicely leads us to the next segment. When I think of hype, this is probably what I think of the most, the technology sector, a field where products are sold for their ability to completely change, revolutionize the world. ChatGPT, self-driving cars, cryptocurrency, NFTs, they all took a hit this year. ChatGPT lit the world on fire when it released at the end of last year, but since then, it and other generative AI have had a bit of the sheen and a bit of that speculative, world-changing veneer come off. There have been legal challenges, high-profile calls to halt progress on the technology, but I think more importantly, people have been using the product, and for the vast majority, there isn't much there that is actually life-changing. A useful tool, to be sure, but there are certain problems with the underlying technology that may have become more apparent, like the hallucinations, and something really important is the viability economically, which may make this thing fizzle out before we even realize it. This was also a big year in cryptocurrency, with a lot of the high-profile hype men in the first generation getting their comeuppance, and NFTs have also been confirmed dead. What with a reported 95% of the stuff being worth nothing now. Another indicator of the relative worthlessness of much of the hyped blockchain technology. And in additional news of vaporware, Meta's metaverse was also found to be an ugly barren wasteland with basically no users. A $36 billion gamble that Zuckerberg thought was going to be so lucrative that he changed the company's name over it. So definitely not a billionaire just jumping on a bandwagon, right? Self-driving, a much touted revolution to our way of commuting, did also not fare well this year, with some very high-profile failures. It would be funny if it wasn't also tragic. Both Cruise and Tesla have been hit by this, putting real questions into the progress of the technology and maybe even its fundamental viability. Now, there are probably more things I could cover here because the technology sector is filled with this kind of stuff, like all of Elon Musk's shenanigans, but I don't have time, and that drama farmer's antics get enough attention already. So instead, do you guys remember LK99? This was a thing that blew up the internet for probably a month, maybe a couple weeks, where we were just speculating on this new massive innovation, room temperature superconducting material. And it turns out that was all nonsense. Yay. Excellent. Because of course it was. It's 2023. Of course we don't have any of that cool stuff. Moving on. Sports. Alright, so this is definitely going to be more Australia-centric, but there was a lot that went on here too. We hosted the FIFA Women's World Cup, and in Australia, that was blowing up. That was massive. We were filling up stadiums, okay? This was a big deal here. The Matildas, which is the Australian team, were going strong and making it further than they ever had before, and especially after an incredibly tense quarterfinal and the former World Cup champions being knocked out, there was a real sense in this country we could go all the way to a home World Cup win. They ended up fourth. So, you know, not great. But I'm sure the winners, Spain, took the cup home with pride and joy and no drama to put a dampener on things at all. I'm a big follower of cricket, and the story for this year was kind of insane. Australia has a huge rivalry with England, and with the team that we had coming off of being the #1 test team in the world and winning that contest in a championship game in England, there was a real sense we could finally defeat England on their home turf, something that we haven't done since 2001. For many of the current players, this would be their final chance at achieving that, and we even started out extremely well with 2 nail-biting wins. There was also this hyped up thing called Bazball, and you don't need to worry about the specifics of what that is, but when a whole country is getting behind a buzzword for what is essentially playing aggressively, you know things are a bit overhyped there, okay? So naturally, both sides, fueled by their own hope of victory, and the result, no one won the series. It ended in a draw, and so we head to the next event, and a shorter format of the game, the One-Day World Cup. An event where the eyes weren't actually on Australia, but India, who were just destroying everybody. Going into the final game, they were undefeated. Australia lost the first 2 games of the campaign, but things began to click and build, and Australia were in the final. And if you ask me, what would be the most hyped thing that could have happened? It would be a close game that India wins, because the stadium was packed full of Indian fans, and to see them all cheering and celebrating with fireworks after their team's victory, it would have been pretty extraordinary. But it's 2023, baby. We're getting rid of that hype. And even though they were undefeated and on paper with a much better team, Australia outplayed them on the day. It wasn't even close, and a whole stadium full of fans were silenced. Now, to me, this was pretty hype, but this was the reaction from Australia. Oh, our boys won the World Cup. Nice. What does that make, 6 of them? Good job, lads. Didn't even realize the World Cup was on. So I find this fascinating because as awesome as it is for the Matildas to get as much coverage as they did, they came fourth. The Australian cricket team this year came close to beating India in India, won the World Test Championship, retained the Ashes in England, and won the One-Day World Cup. And the response to all of this winning cricket? The plural crickets. And speaking of ignoring things, let's look at Australian politics for a little bit. We had a referendum, which is a bit of a rarity, so get hyped for that, and the people voted no to giving the Indigenous people a voice to Parliament. So nicely done there, Australia. Very hyped to keep things exactly as they are. Super cool. Economically, with the numbers that showed up, the unemployment rates, the wage growth, the decreasing inflation, you would normally be hearing a ton about how awesome things are. I mean, this government has delivered a surplus for the first time in a million years, and just look at how the previous government were acting when they had one forecasted. They were preemptively making mugs to celebrate a surplus that never came, the absolute mugs. And what do we get now that it's labor in charge? Them just going back to work. And the media, very happy to just ignore all of what is good, because how can you have hype if no one knows about it, okay? And something similar in vein to all this Australian stuff can actually be seen in America too. The economy over there has been going pretty good, but the polls for the president do not reflect that. But in terms of hype being let down, this year hosted the debates for the Republican primary, and what I find really amusing is that though DeSantis was the most hyped contender to actually take on Trump this year, as he has been given more exposure, it is just so evident that he does not have what it takes. And I think after each and every debate, the winner in terms of polling was the guy who didn't show up. Alright, so since we're getting more geopolitical, the wars. So wars are never good, but if you remember last year, Ukraine initiated an incredible counter-offensive and managed to reclaim a whole bunch of territory that I don't think many people believed they were capable of doing. And so it was for what felt like months we were hearing about the next counter-offensive, one where with even more Western weaponry they would be able to get an even better foothold onto the war and change the tide of the conflict. Reality though had other things in mind, and what we would get is the West being a bit slow and a bit wavering in their support, the Russians hunkering down, and the counteroffensive stalling out completely. But with all of what has happened, we might have forgotten the insane story of Prigozhin, a man who was bold enough to not only take aim at the Russian top brass while fighting in Ukraine, but also rode a convoy basically all the way to Moscow in a semi-coup, and it looked for a good while that he would get away with all of it. But, dude, what are you doing in Russia? And, of course, over in the Middle East, on October 7th, we had Hamas attack into Israeli territory. And though they achieved something quite remarkable in breaching the defenses, the response by Israel has been just devastating. Barbarism on one side is met with it on the other with much more than equal measure, and though both sides can and will claim the moral high ground, I don't think you can look at what has happened in this year and come out with much of a justification for the violence, death, and destruction on either side. The dream of peace in the Middle East, I think, was dealt a devastating blow this year. On the personal level, this has been a very lean year for me in terms of productivity. I think I had a goal of beating the number of videos I did last year, and I don't think I was even close. I also thought I would be better at cataloging the calendar stuff, which I was talking about last year, and it's like, nah, it just kind of fizzled out, as you can sort of tell by just July. I think after that there's basically nothing for the rest, because I just didn't do it. I was way too slack. I also wanted to get a video about Tears of the Kingdom out, which I started in like October, and yeah, I still haven't even started the editing for that, so yeah, there's just no way that I was going to get that out before the end of the year. But I mean, there's some reasons for this. I had a holiday in October, and when I came back to Australia in November, it was just like settling into the routine, getting work done, finishing the script, and the script would just not come together for that Tears of the Kingdom video. But then I finally get it together, start recording, and then that's just when all of the rain, all of the storms just came in. And luckily for me, there was a massive hailstorm. And that knocked out a skylight, which started leaking into the kitchen. And so that is something that I had to go and deal with. So yay for dealing with insurance companies. And then, you go into the Christmas festivities and having to meet a lot of people and stuff like that. And so, yeah. So there are excuses, but still, I would have really liked to get that done, but not to be. So that's a little bit of hype that I guess I would have had. I would have psyched myself up for that, but it just didn't come to pass. Incidentally, even the trip to Vietnam, which should have been a really nice trip, and it was, to be fair, had a twinge of disappointment associated with it, because the country has changed. It's gotten wealthier, and so the streets are cleaner and all that kind of stuff, but with that wealth and status, the populace are like, we're going to buy lots of cars. And cars are all over the place, and it's not good because it leads to more congestion, And I just don't like the idea of all of this infrastructure that they're building just to suit cars. Because they're going to go the route of America and Australia, where you have the... It's just not good for urban development, in my opinion. And especially for a country like Vietnam with its density, it just seems like, public transport, trains and all that kind of stuff are the way to go. But we got cars now, and it's super frustrating. Anyway, that about wraps it up for my summary of the year and the theme of anti-hype. And if you've got anything that fits a theme that you think I've missed, or if you've got any personal stories that fit that theme, feel free to leave them in the comments. I'd love to see anything that you've got. I'll just leave this all with another kind of guest story about my trip in Vietnam. I remember this moment very vividly. We were leaving the hotel and heading back to the airport, and they'd given us this sort of luxurious van thing that had its own reclining seats with its own little cup holders for you, and like every chair had its own charging port for your phone. It was really neat. And I remember sitting there and thinking, yeah, I'm content and happy with how the holiday went. It's been a good holiday. We celebrated 2 whole weddings, and at the end even traveled a bit with the Vietnamese side of the family and gave them a taste of the luxurious 5-star treatment for a bit. Everything felt right and appropriate. We didn't stay too long, we stayed just the perfect amount. And it's time to go home. And then we begin the process of getting the stuff out of the car. And then as I look back at the car, leaving and driving away with that sense of serenity sort of still circling my brain, the finality of the trip, I realized that I had, of course, left my phone charging in the car. And that was 2023.